Welcome back. I'm Tim Erlander with the Republican Roundtable. It's good to be with you again. And with me once again is my co-host, Mark Sullivan. Mark, it's good to see you on this nice cold day.
Good to be back here, Tim.
And our friend who's going to be our guest today is Andy Cilek. And Andy is the founder and executive director of the Minnesota Voters Alliance. And he's here to talk about election cheating by Democrats, right?
Election cheating by Democrats. That's an interesting way to put it.
That's exactly what we're going to talk about.
Let's talk about that.
And we got enough to last a whole half hour, don't we?
I think we might.
Andy, first of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about the Minnesota Voters Alliance?
Well, the Minnesota Voters Alliance is a group that I started, and I think this is about my third time on, so thanks again for having me on. I thought you might have been desperate for guests, but either way, I thought I better come and see you.
We still got some good information here.
Well, this is our 10th year. The Minnesota Voters Alliance, we were formed in 2005. We're a 501c4 organization, so we're a tax exempt, and that's different from a 501c3. 501c3s are more educational and charitable organization. We're more of a political organization, although we do not endorse candidates and support any political parties. So we're not affiliated with any parties.
Right. There's still some restrictions as far as I know on the tax exempt.
And so for a number of years, we focused on primarily petition-type activist issues. And in the last 4 or 5 years, we've been focused in the court system. So our new slogan is expanding liberty through legal action. So we're one of the only conservative groups in Minnesota that actually focuses in the legal system to expand the rights of citizens.
Well, that's just great. We need a few of those. We got so darn many Democrats who pretend to be doing that and typically get wonderful coverage in the media who take them at face value. You get any coverage and get taken at face value by any chance?
We've gotten a lot of coverage. We've received a lot of coverage, I should say, in the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, I had the privilege of being on Fox News Channel about a year and a half ago, national. I've been on Channel 9, Channel 5, and debated numerous people. We had a debate on photo ID with the ACLU.
Well, that would have been fun.
Matter of fact, I think we had you on for photo ID and voter fraud.
Right. We're still working on the same issue.
Was that the last time? I'm not sure if you've been on since then, but I know one of the times that you were on, it had to do with the voter ID amendment and exactly what was going on with that.
Right. Well, alongside the photo ID amendment, it was right around that time when we started our Election Day Registration lawsuit, which is our big issue. Yeah. We went through the federal court first, and now we're going to be going through the state court here in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So some of these cases that I've been learning, I'm not an attorney, although I do work with attorneys on a regular basis. Some of these cases take 4, 5, 6 years. And Tim, you're an attorney, I believe, right?
Yes, I am.
Some of these, like the Greg Wurzel case, when he had that judicial election.
Yeah, that went on forever.
7 or 8 years. And actually our attorneys, Mormon and Cardall, were one of the attorneys representing him, and they won in the U.S. Supreme Court. Yeah. Had to do with free speech on what judicial candidates can or can't say.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And so we have an initiative and referendum case in Lino Lakes. The firefighters in Lino Lakes approached us about 6 months ago. And that's an interesting case, if you want to touch briefly on that.
Go ahead.
It's a case involving initiative and referendum. In case your audience isn't familiar with that, there's 106 cities in Minnesota that have their own charter, that are home rule charter cities. I'm sure Bloomington is one, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Rochester, all the big cities have a home rule charter. In my humble opinion, the most important rights of a home rule charter for the citizens is the right to initiative and referendum. Point blank, there's no other more important right. And what is initiative and referendum?
Which is pretty much where they can pass a petition, they get enough signatures, they can actually get change put on the ballot for a vote.
Right. They can primarily do 2 things. Well, there's a third thing. They can initiate a new ordinance to get to vote on, and they can repeal a bad one that they don't like if they get appropriate number of signatures, often in a certain time frame.
There's usually no shortage of bad ones.
Right. Or a charter amendment, too, which is a form of a referendum. Right. So anyway, in Lino Lakes, they share, the city of Lino Lakes shares a fire department with the cities of Centennial and Circle Pines. And under the name of it is the Centennial Fire District. And they've operated for 28 years under a joint powers agreement. Okay, so they share a fire department. At that time, Lino Lakes was the smaller, I believe, of the three cities. Now they're the bigger of the three cities.
Yeah.
And in January of last year, the city council and mayor put a 2-year notice into the Centennial Fire District to actually withdraw from the fire district. They have to give a 2-year notice as part of their contract. And so they did that, and the Centennial Fire District, mainly a volunteer force, they weren't buying the arguments. They didn't think it was going to reduce response times and it was going to cost more money and all these things. So they went out and got 900 and some signatures to go on the ballot. And that ordinance that they wanted to get on the ballot, or initiative, was simply to say if the city of Lino Lakes is going to withdraw from a fire district, they have to do so by ordinance, and the citizens have to vote on it. Okay? And the city council and mayor rejected them. So they contacted us. We went to court in Anoka County District Court.
That's where you'd have to go.
And the judge there, Tammy Frederickson, is a former city attorney. So she sided with the city. And so now we're appealing to the Court of Appeals, and that hearing is coming up, I believe, on March 26th, and I think it's going to be jam-packed. And Channel 5 picked it up, the Star and Tribune picked it up. It's a big story. But
once again here, not so much the issue is the fact of whether they can do it or can't do it.
I'm glad you asked that. We have no interest in, it doesn't concern us at all on whether or not the citizens want to withdraw from the fire district.
Right.
It's totally their
That's
decision.
their business,
Right.
yeah.
What we're saying, if that decision is allowed to stand, it will impact every city
Right.
in Minnesota, including Bloomington.
It'll set a precedent.
It'll set a precedent.
Literally, so.
So what we're saying is, in the ordinances, in the Lino Lakes ordinances, it specifically says that the Centennial Fire District chief shall enforce the laws of the fire district. So it's in their ordinances. The only way to change an ordinance is via another ordinance. Okay, so when the city withdrew put a 2-year notice in to the other cities withdrawing from the fire district, that was simply an administrative action. They still didn't change the ordinance.
Right.
Right? So
I get it.
So
Keep going.
what we're saying is that if they want to wait 2 years before they change the ordinance, well, essentially they've wiped out the citizens' right for a referendum because all the buildings are already going to be built. You see what I mean? So essentially, we say they have no legal justification or basis to reject that initiative. And they already said it was valid. It had enough signatures. It had everything it needed. So that's probably going to go to the Supreme Court, Tim.
I probably will, yeah.
And I think it just fascinates me when a government will turn its back on the citizens. I mean, when you have 900 people showing up at your door,
That surprises you?
why not just put it on the ballot and let people vote on it? I mean, isn't that?
Government's a business,
Well,
and you're interfering with the way they make money, and both officially and unofficially.
More than that, you have the individuals on the city council. They have what they want. And it doesn't matter what the voter wants anymore. I mean, they just get.
I think that's right.
Basically,
that's right.
we want it our way, and you don't count anymore. Yeah.
Okay, let's get to our item
we
that we
have
were
a-
going to talk about here.
lot of-
Election day registration. We have an issue on this, and you've got a plaintiff involved, right?
We have a big issue with election day registration, Tim and Mark.
Let's
And
start at the beginning.
Well,
Each place.
the problem we noticed, along with the photo ID amendment, the photo ID amendment that failed barely. Most people are shocked of how that even failed.
I'm very surprised.
Because 90% of the people believe in requiring a photo ID. But the photo ID amendment was more than just requiring a photo ID. It also involved a equivalent registration system, which means that the people had to be checked, their eligibility had to be checked, the same-day registrants, just like the pre-registrants. See, in Minnesota, there's
Right there. It was a what do they call a provisional ballot. Basically, if they registered the same day,
Absolutely. Yep, that's
yeah,
exactly
their vote
right.
did not count until their registration had checked out.
And
So- so it's
44
called
other
a provisional
states
ballot.
have provisional ballots. And that's all, I'm glad you mentioned that. I probably would have forgot to mention
Yeah,
that.
I had to stop and.
That's all our lawsuit seeks to do, is to implement provisional ballots.
Right.
We're not seeking to eliminate same-day registration, okay? But what we want, see, in presidential election years, over 500,000 people come walking in Minnesota in a typical presidential election year. And they register and vote on election day. And now their ballot is counted. And then, and it's all in our PowerPoint presentation, and that I think they might show some on the video. But the statutes, and this is right out of the statutes and the county auditor election guide. In 1974, all new voter registration applications submitted on election day must be verified after the election. Does that sound like a problem?
Right.
It
No,
shouldn't,
yeah,
no.
no.
Was there any time limits on this?
To put this in context, the votes are counted on election day.
The votes are counted.
They
Absolutely.
counted, and to determine whether Joe won over Sam.
Right.
But it's not until after the election that they check to make sure that the vote is actually a good vote or not.
That's right. It's complete insanity. It's upside down.
And once it's all done, it's too late to go back because you don't know, okay, this person was ineligible, couldn't vote, shouldn't vote, whatever. But you can't go back and say, well, we're going to pull this vote back because you don't know what he voted for.
Right. They don't care. And Mark
Yeah, they don't
Ritchie,
care.
he fought us tooth and nail.
Well, of course he will.
And Steve Simon, is the new Secretary of State, is no different.
That's right.
He's just another political hack,
Right.
and they don't want to tighten election day registration because
My
they know
own
it's
feeling
unfair.
is that election day registration is designed for fraud. The only reason you would have it would be to enable fraud to take place. That just seems obvious to me. It's not officially, you can imagine a system where you wouldn't have fraud doing it, but that just seems to me to be a very
Right.
Well,
fraud-producing
I'm
equipment.
kind of hardcore that if you haven't thought far enough ahead to register in advance,
Exactly.
you shouldn't be voting to begin with. You know,
Right.
But that's not what's going on here. I mean, it's basically they're saying, okay, at the last minute you decide you're going to vote, you can go in, you can register. Okay, that's great, but there's got to be some way that we can verify that it's a good vote before we count it.
So when you look at this verify after the election, what we've done is we've done extensive Data Practices Act requests, okay, asking for data. We want data on how many people were marked challenged when they were checked from 2008. 48,000 people from the 2008 election, according to our Data Practices Act request from the Secretary of State. When they went to check them after the election, those new voter registration applications, they couldn't be confirmed as being eligible to vote.
Okay,
48,000.
48,000 out of how many?
There was 540,000.
Okay, so we're talking about 1 out of 10.
About 1 out of 10.
About 1 out of 10
Right,
votes they were unable to verify.
That's right. And of those 48,000, 17,000 were marked challenged, and 31,000 were marked inactive. So of the ones that are marked challenged, when they went to compare them to the state's databases, they didn't check out as being eligible. And in Minnesota, they don't check them or challenge them until the next election.
Right.
And the Constitution, it specifically says that ineligible voters, and it lists who's ineligible. We have the slide: felons, people under guardianship that have restricted voting rights, non-citizens, that the state shall not permit them to vote at any election in the state.
Okay, but if we have same-day registration, okay, they check out as being challenged this time. So you say next time it's not going to count until then. But next time they come in and they register same day again, you're not going to know until after the election.
You're back to the same problem.
That's why it's
a no-no.
set up for fraud.
If they're marked inactive, okay, they won't show up on the roster at the next election. So then they can just register again.
Inactive, yeah.
If they're marked challenged, they will show up on the roster.
And
But
now,
all they got to do is swear that they.
And now if
they're
a
eligible.
registration shows up and they send out the card and it comes back and saying, Well, the address this voter gave is the middle of a baseball field somewhere.
Right.
Well, kind of, hey, is this good, bad? We don't know, but basically, pretty good bet that was a bad vote.
Not only do they not know, they don't want to know. That's the key.
And they're
That to me
and I
is
know
quite
there's
obvious.
thousands of those
Yeah.
that come back too.
That's right. You hear the Democrat, their talking points, Steve Simon on the campaign trail, the new Secretary of State. All the Democrats say is voter fraud is at an absolute minimum. There's hardly any voter fraud.
We've only prosecuted a couple. And the
Yeah,
thing
but-
is, if you can't find them, you can't prosecute them.
Well, that's a small problem, Mark. There's another part of this.
If you go to the ball field and the guy's not there, how do you find him to prosecute
No, but even
him?
if you find him, this is interesting. And I brought one here. This is on our PowerPoint presentation.
Okay.
Here is a person who was convicted for an ineligible voter knowingly votes. Okay, and he only got a $100 fine, and I believe it was stayed. Conviction deemed a gross misdemeanor pursuant. But the only way in Minnesota you can get convicted of voter fraud is if you're stupid enough to admit that you shouldn't have done it.
Admit that you knew you
Okay,
shouldn't have done
so
it.
we don't really care whether.
So
whether-
you're caught. You say, "Oh, really? I didn't
Right.
know." I plead ignorance, and they're kind of like, "Okay, well, we're sorry. Just try not to do it again."
Right.
Yeah.
But we're
The
concerned
crime-
with ineligible voting,
Andy,
not fraudulent
Is
voting.
this Minnesota
Isn't
nice or
it
what?
obvious, though, that the criminal law is really inadequate to prevent voter fraud? Because the damage is done when the individual is voted.
That's when the damage is done, absolutely.
And then you have to go charging him with the crime, especially a misdemeanor. People shrug that stuff off like water in a shower.
Right. I think the oath, even Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court, I mean, he said, oath? I said, big deal. Anybody can sign an oath.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
But
And
interestingly, in
people are not
Minnesota-
afraid of perjury.
Interestingly, in Minnesota, they let people sign the oath, except under one circumstance, for residents. If you don't have an ID or a utility bill to prove residence on registration, and you can't find a voucher,
Right.
you get turned away. We have 2 plaintiffs that were actually turned away, and they begged to sign the oath. So this whole idea that they really put too much emphasis on the oath is really a bunch of nonsense. What we're concerned about is the Secretary of State has data on ineligible voters. In fact, the one statute right here is pursuant 201155, report on felony convictions. The state court administrator shall report regularly all felons to the Secretary of State, right? So and there's one for the Department of Public Safety to report non-citizens, the Department of Health for the deceased. All these agencies are required by statutes to send data to the Secretary of State. So the state knows who's ineligible to vote. Our claim is that those people cannot be permitted to vote under the Constitution. The Constitution says you can't let them vote. So by virtue of the fact that they're going to check them after the election,
It's the cat's out of the bag, and
The
it's
cat's
too
out of the
late.
bag.
And once again, this is checking the ones they can find.
this is checking the ones they can find. Now, Kirk Stensrud, and we were talking about this before we started here, is Kirk Stensrud was a legislator in Eden Prairie, as you know,
Right.
where I'm from.
Yeah.
And he lost in 2012 by about 200 votes.
And that-
He ran again in 2014 and lost by 30 votes, which triggered a recount,
Okay.
an automatic recount. He called us asking if there's anything that we could do, and we actually submitted 2 Data Practice Act requests on his behalf to the Secretary of State and Department of Public Safety. And guess what? We asked for data on all those 1,100. In his race, there were 19,000 voters in Eden Prairie.
Right.
Over 1,000 of them were same-day registrants. You know what's interesting? To this day, 2.5 months or whatever, 3 months after the election, Kirk Stensrud, the candidate, doesn't know if any of those 1,000 same-day registrants were in fact eligible to vote.
If we run the numbers, let's say, just say hypothetically, earlier we figured 1 out of 10, approximately. Okay,
Right.
1,000 votes. That's 100 votes potentially were, let's say, bad or unprovable, whatever. Okay, and he lost by how many on the recount? 42 votes?
42 votes.
And mathematically, if you want to say that, you got 100 votes that potentially are, by the numbers, are probably bad.
That's right. That's right. And
Now,
what we
there's
also
one
learned,
more thing that really strikes me as important, and that is, even if you establish that the person was not eligible to vote, how do you know which vote in all those thousands of votes cast that he cast and who was it for?
they're irretrievably cast.
That's
and
right,
you
they're
can't-
irretrievable.
You can't pull back
That's
and
right.
say he voted for so-and-so.
Right. So
You don't know.
In Minnesota, as the Star and Tribune would say, we have and Mark Ritchie would say that we have the best election system in the country. And I'm here to tell you,
Well,
based on 4 years of studying
Best
it,
election
it's the worst.
system for
Yeah.
who?
It's the worst. And you know, absentee ballots, Mark and Tim, were you aware of the law last year that now there's no excuse absentee voting? Mm-hmm. Right? You don't need an excuse anymore for absentee voting?
You don't need a reason. You can just say, I want to
Yeah, I've
vote
done it
absentee.
myself.
and-
I've gone in and voted absentee,
We're,
and
we're
that
like
was it.
46 days before the election, you can start to cast your absentee
That's right.
ballots.
Mhm.
What we've just learned in the last 4 months from talking to the Minneapolis Director of Elections, the Washington County Director of Elections, just a lot of questions.
Yeah.
We found out that the absentee ballots that accompany a voter registration application,
Right.
so people who want to register and vote absentee, those all get tucked away in an envelope, and those voter registration applications don't get checked till after the election,
Right.
just like the same-day registration.
Once again, the votes count,
So-
and they don't check to
That's
see
right.
if they're good or not until afterwards,
now
even
instead-
though they were sent in 40 days ahead
Right.
of
So
time.
now instead of 500,000 people coming in on election day and not be checked, now it's going to be in the next presidential election closer to 700,000 people. So almost a quarter to a third of the people in Minnesota are going to be voting, and they're not going to be checked for eligibility until after the election. And yet all these elections in Minnesota are going to be certified. It's absolutely ludicrous.
Yeah, it is.
You know, I mean, and so that's where we come in. We went, and I know we don't have that much time left, but we have a big victory to tell the audience. It's good when you're in the legal
Okay.
battles that you can get a victory.
Yeah, it is.
So we filed a Data Practice Act request on behalf of candidate Kirk Stensrud to the Secretary of State and Department of Public Safety. And we wanted all the data on all the challenged voters, we wanted all the lists of all
Right,
the ineligible voters that statutes
Okay.
require him to have, or to be sent to the Secretary of State. And they said you can't have it. It's not public data. So isn't it interesting, Mark? I can get a CD for $46 for the public to get everybody in your city, all the active voters, all your information, all your voting history, obviously not who you voted for.
Right.
And your neighbor two doors down is been a voter convicted of a felony. They won't give me that information, but they'll give me your information. So anyway, so the Secretary of State said you can't have it. We went to IPAD. And for the folks in the audience who don't know what IPAD, it stands for Information Policy Analysis Division. It's a government agency
Right.
that's set up for folks like you and me. When we get rejected from a Data Practice Act request, that's the first step you go. It's cheap, doesn't cost anything.
Yeah.
You send an email, and they're all attorneys. They came back and sided with us, saying they believe the data we asked for is public. Now, they're not a court, okay? But what the statutes say is that the court, which we're going to now on that Data Practice Act,
But it is an opinion, a legal opinion that carries some weight when you're going back
right,
to.
and the law says the court has to give deference to a favorable opinion from IPAD. So now, now we have a government entity that agrees with us the data we want. So in other words, we asked for Kirk Stensrud all the data on those 1,000 same-day registrants and all the ineligible voters, and the Secretary of State said we can't have it. Mm-hmm. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it is.
Isn't that interesting? So here the candidate, Kirk Stensrud, the election was certified.
Yeah.
His opponent is sworn in down at the Capitol as a sitting legislator.
Yeah, and in all honesty, you're not going to be able to go back, even if you get the information, you're not going to be able to go back and say unseat him, put Kurt in.
Exactly.
Yeah,
We were
but
already.
you want to basically say, okay, this is,
Right.
that 42 votes, this is how many actually bad people,
But that's right. But here's the good news. The good news is Kirk's agreed to be a plaintiff in our lawsuit. So it's going to add additional standing. We also have election judges. We want as much standing as possible,
I get
right?
it.
Because for our legal case here in Ramsey County that we'll be filing probably in the next less than 30 days. But what Kirk Stensrud is saying to the court is, look, I couldn't challenge my election. I couldn't contest the election. I couldn't get the data in 4 days. So and they wouldn't give it to us. So one of his arguments is, because you have to show harm, right, to a
Yes,
court.
you
You're an
do.
attorney. You have to show harm. one of the things he's saying is, look, I'm not complaining about, I'm not trying to go back and change that election.
Right.
But I want to run again. I'm a sitting legislator. I lost 2 very, very close elections.
Was a sitting legislator.
I was a sitting legislator. The last one was by a couple dozen votes. These people weren't, 1,000 of the people weren't even checked to this day, Your Honor. And I want to make sure that's changed before the next election.
I go running, I mean, and it is, Tim and I can both verify that, you run for these offices. It's a lot of work. I mean, it takes, it's not just go out and throw your hat in the ring and say, okay, vote for me or not. I mean, there's a lot of work involved in it.
We're getting a little bit short of time. I think we should address one thing that just strikes me as extremely important. Is there any compelling reason why we have to have same-day registration? Would society collapse? Would the sun stop shining if they abolished it? Is there any reason?
I don't think so. I mean, there's only 7 states in the union that have it, and the Democrats want to make it mandatory for every state.
I know, of course they do. They're the ones who traditionally
Keith Ellison and Amy Klobuchar, I mean, they're big proponents of all this.
I understand
Same-day
that.
registration.
They're looking at their political advantage.
Haul them in by the busload and just say, hey.
But they want it the way Minnesota does it for the whole nation. They love the Minnesota election
That's
format,
exactly
which
right.
is completely upside down.
Yeah.
And backwards.
There is no basic reason for having same-day registration. The state does not have anything to gain by getting the nincompoops, the people who don't know the difference between George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, to stumble into the polling booths to try to figure out what they're going to do. There's just no state interest, there's no valid interest in that.
Right, but I think politically, though, it'd be a tough deal to get rid of it. And
I think you're right, it would.
And even in the court systems, we're not asking the court to get rid of it.
They try and get rid of same-day registration. It's like, you start getting people claiming Jim Crow and everything else.
Oh, sure.
If you try and do it. So we're stuck with it. We're not going to get rid of it, no matter how much any of us hate it. We're not going to get rid of it. The thing is, how do you make it fair? How do you at least put some kind of a check on it? The provisional balloting, where you vote today, your vote will be counted.
Well, the technology is such that you could check this all out quickly.
Yeah, and I think the drafters and framers of the Minnesota Constitution back in 1857 or 58 would roll over in their graves if they
certainly
knew
would.
that this was adopted in 1974.
I know they'd be pretty disgusted too. Well, I think we're just about at the end, folks. Andy, thank you for coming in. This has been a good discussion.
Tim, Mark.
And we'll see you next time. And let's just hope we have some clean elections in the future. Thank you.